Hi, good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Whitney. My name is Megan Hoyer. I'm the Director of Public Programs and Public Engagement here. And it's my great pleasure to introduce tonight's conversation, organized in conjunction with the exhibition Nick Mauss Transmissions, which is currently on view on the 8th floor. As most of you hopefully already know and have experienced, Transmissions is a multidisciplinary work by the artist Nick Mauss, exploring the relationship between modernist ballet and the avant-garde visual arts in New York from the 1930s to the 1950s. This is Nick's first solo exhibition in an American museum, and it embodies his hybrid mode of working that merges the roles of curator, artist, and scholar. At the Whitney, he brings together his own works alongside historical photographs, sculptures, paintings, drawings, film, and video from the Whitney's holdings and those of other public and private collections, all presented within a layered exhibition designed by Nick that allows for the works to be seen in a new light. He has also worked with an incredible group of dancers to he's worked collaboratively with an incredible group of dancers to create daily performances that use the exhibition as a source and as a set. There's much more to say about each of these elements, and tonight's conversation will consider the multiple intersecting histories that Nick's project draws from and illuminates in such compelling ways. I want to acknowledge my colleagues Scott Rothkopf and Elisabeth Sussman, co-curators of the exhibition, and Greta Hartenstein and Ali Tepper, who assisted them on the project. The three esteemed scholars and curators who Nick has invited to share the stage with him tonight, Elisabeth Sussman, Jennifer Homans, and Elena Filipovic, have all been integral to his work and thinking in different ways. Elisabeth Sussman is Sondra Gilman, curator of photography at the Whitney and co-curator of Transmissions, as I just mentioned, and has been in dialogue with Nick since she invited him to participate in the 2012 biennial. For that show, he organized a presentation of early 20th century works in the Whitney's collection. And I think ever since then, Elisabeth has been thinking about and figuring out how to invite Nick back and has supported this project all along the way. She also has a history of curating performance in museum settings that I hope she will share with us tonight. Jennifer Homans is the founder and director of Center for Ballet and the Arts at NYU, where Nick spent a year as a fellow and was able to conduct much of the research for Transmissions. In addition to running Center for Ballet and the Arts, Jennifer is also a distinguished scholar in residence in history and European and Mediterranean studies at NYU, and she's the author of Apollo's Angels, A History of Ballet from 2010, named one of the 10 best books of the year by the New York Times and a finalist for the National Book Critics Circle Award. She's written for the New York Times, The Guardian, and the New York Review of Books, among others, and was the dance critic for the New Republic from 2001 to 2014. And I have to mention that before becoming a writer and scholar, she was also a professional dancer and performed with the Pacific Northwest Ballet and other companies. And also, very importantly, she's currently at work on a new book, George Balanchine, A History, which will be published by Random House soon, very soon. No, okay, not so, under contract. And finally, Elena Filipovic is director and curator of the Kunsthalle Basel, and she is currently at work on a new project with Nick for, I think, the coming spring, next year? Yes? Far in the future. Her research and curatorial work both consider exhibition making as practice. In her book, The Apparently Marginal Activities of Marcel Duchamp, which came out of her PhD thesis at Princeton, Elena focuses on a series of fugitive operations that Duchamp incited between 1913 and 1969, tracking how ostensibly non-artistic roles, among them administrator, archivist, art advisor, curator, publicist, reproduction maker, and salesman, were deployed by Duchamp in order to test theorized position and even constitute his work as such. She's also recently edited The Artist as Curator, an anthology, which surveys this mode of practice in modern and contemporary art. I probably should also mention she's the author of David Hammond's Blizzard Ball Sale, just because that's now what it's been tweeted about recently, so I can't resist. So a quick note about the format, and then I'm going to turn things over to Nick. We're going to start with a presentation from Nick about the exhibition, and then he'll invite Elisabeth, Jennifer, and Elena to join him for a conversation on stage, and we'll definitely also want to leave time for questions and conversation with you all. So I'll be the timekeeper. So please join me in welcoming Nick.
Thank you, Megan, and thanks everyone for coming. I'm going to throw a lot of images at you. I thought the best thing I could do this evening as a springboard into conversation is to show you some of the things I was looking at that led me to the making of Transmissions. Many people have been asking me to explain my relationship to dance because I think they're curious to know why somebody with no personal history with ballet would make this exhibition. I would say that I'm interested in how dance makes meaning, how it is related to language, how it remakes space, and how it enacts, inscribes, or invents a kind of social modeling. I didn't grow up with ballet, and honestly, I never expected to make an exhibition such as this one. Perhaps my first access to dance, besides a viewing of Charles Atlas's Hail the New Puritan, was the writing of Jill Johnston, which gave me a much more vivid proximity to Judson. And then as she transitioned into her vast experimental, multi-voiced field of messy interactions, contradictions, and enmeshment to criticism as an art form. As long as I've even had a semblance of a studio, I've had a copy of this dance notation on my wall. It's a page from a Baroque dance manual published in 1748 called The Master of the Dance by Pierre Rameau. The frame of the page marks the contours of a room as seen from above. The parallel zigzag of text moves through the graphic space, just as the couple it is intended to instruct are meant to move through the space of this room in which they are dancing. It is at once highly conceptual and graphically inventive, the text itself prescribing and becoming the figures and movements they have internalized from this page. I love the way in which it says something very complicated in a simple way. The graphic, the verbal, is transformed into the nonverbal, into gesture, duration, and courtesy. This is a map drawn by Natalie Barney of the many guests who came over the years to the salon she hosted in the Doric Temple of Friendship beside her house in Paris from 1910 until around 1960. It's nearly impossible to read or figure out. And as such, it is a true representation of the open form of this kind of gathering, but also an index of the passage of people through a particular place and time, a kind of chaotic complexity, rendered with humor and charm. You can see there's a little teapot and teacups in the middle of the room. The map admits its own insufficiency. I can decipher a few names in it: Colette, Rilke, Juna Barnes, Virgil Thompson, and can only guess at some of the other presences and absences. As an organizing principle and as a drawing, this map is a great inspiration to me. When I was a student, I became adamant about piecing together a sense of history for myself that I could relate to. I remember the shock I felt in discovering the work of artists such as Florence Stadtheimer or Charlotte Salomon, and realized that any canon would have to be regarded with extreme suspicion or thrown out the window. Maybe the feeling was something along the lines of Lawrence Wiener's statement: I had to admit to myself that I made art because I was unsatisfied with the configuration that I saw before me. This is the dedication page of Charles Henry Ford's volume of poems from 1972 titled Flag of Ecstasy. Not a list of names one necessarily associates together, and there's many unknowns. It provokes the questions, who are they and how are they all related? I'm just going to skip through these, this great picture of Charles Henry Ford. These collages by the Bauhaus artist Santi Shavinsky were made after his emigration to the United States, where he taught at Black Mountain College. And they illustrate a stage concept he developed in Germany called spectrodrama. Seeing these works for the first time was a kind of epiphany in that it drew a direct line from Bauhaus performance to Cage, Cunningham, Johns, and Rauschenberg. Suddenly there was a continuum where previously there had been separation. This Walker Evans photograph from 1945 shows graffiti on the backstage door of the School of American Ballet. It's of course very sophisticated graffiti. Where else would you find a rendering of Nijinsky, an afternoon of a fawn scrawled on the wall? But Walker Evans and ballet, that was another relationship that had never occurred to me. And here's a great example of how early 20th century fashion magazines can tell you more about the resonance of the avant-garde than any textbook. It's a photograph by Cecil Beaton of Charles Henry Ford in a costume by Salvador Dali, accompanied by Diana Vreeland's "Why Don't You" prose. "What about putting your head into a bag of gold net?" she asks. "What about taking all your colored handkerchiefs and bandaging your entire body? Or, with a necklace of thread spools, going as a gitane? What about hanging a gold frame around your shoulders and calling yourself a portrait? What about taking last year's tulle ball dress and singeing it? Berard introduced burnt ballerinas into the last act of the Symphonie Fantastique." This is a cover for Vogue by Eugene Berman, with the painted model showing us her back. And in these photographs by Beaton for Vogue, the models have their backs to us and then face us in a way that makes me think of Frederick Ashton's Symphonic Variations. And here's Man Ray's contribution to the September 1934 issue of Bazaar, titled "Fashions by Radio," for which the artist sent images of models in the latest styles from Paris to New York via an early form of the fax machine. The new technology used by Man Ray actually prevents visual access to the new in fashion. Man Ray also made this portrait of the choreographer Bronislava Nijinská for Bazaar in 1922. And this is a so-called photo painting that Vogue commissioned from the artist Pavel Chelichev, titled "Room in a Seashell," that closely resembles his stage designs for the multimedia Ballet Errant, seen here in photographs by Ilse Bing. Finally, this is a photograph by the commercial photographer Leslie Gill of Ellie Nadelman's sculptures arranged as if posing in a tableau in his garden. This is all very associative, but it reflects the way in which I was able to make links over time and zero in on an interest in how bodies, specifically performing bodies, including fashion models, were part of the construction of modern images in America. So how did I get here? I think it was actually something I was seeking out in a history of 20th century painting, of modernist painting, that brought me directly into ballet, where I saw that artists I love, like Natalia Goncharova and Marie Laurencin, made some of their greatest works for the ballet stage. And I became more and more involved in this interface in the way that painting was brought into modernist ballet. As Lincoln Kirstein wrote about Diaghilev's catalytic genius, "Revolutionary cubism hit the ballet with its ton of bricks and horrified the old guard ballet lovers," which was Diaghilev's earnest intention. Social satire, American jazz, the everyday continental vacation, and boulevard life of the 1920s, Dada, neoclassicism, the falsely naive, the falsely archaic, and decorative folklore were all exposed to the caprice of Diaghilev's ingenious combinations. And I started looking at the images of performers and realized that there's not many moving image documents. Definitely not for the Ballet Russe because Diaghilev forbade it. But even later, the documents that exist are mostly photographic. And they have a strong erotic charge, which drew me in. And I think it may also be one of the reasons that ballet did become such a popular form in the 20th century. There was a moment in my ongoing conversations with Elisabeth Sussman about what this exhibition would become when I came in with a new constellation of ideas and images, maybe a bit like this presentation, and she said, "I can see it, it's an essay." And then in 2016, as a fellow at the Center for Ballet and the Arts, I found more of a foothold in terms of what I wanted to make, both as an experimental exhibition and as a time and place to focus on. I think of the exhibition at the Whitney as a kind of portrait of New York. I've said that it's also a very different New York with different freedoms and different limitations. But I was drawn into a moment before the 60s, which is really the period that had been important to me, especially when I was in school, and really seeking out what would be the pre-queer art history of a certain moment in New York, and why certain histories and social memories had been occluded. Here are some of my earliest notes in which I tried to draw some connections, both anchored in history, biography, and some more distant connections or arcs of influence that I was still wondering about. There were many maps such as these along the way of making the exhibition. But one way in was certainly through the photographs of George Platt Lyons, who was the official photographer for New York City Ballet, but also a renowned fashion photographer. And the Kinsey Institute in Bloomington, Indiana owns a huge archive of his photographs. And I went to Bloomington and looked at all 5,000 images. They're kind of jumbled together. Ballet photographs, fashion photographs, erotic photographs that he could never show, portraits of bourgeois families, scenes of military allegory, fantasies of Greek mythology. And I thought, rather than just pick out the ballet photographs, I would want to show a broader range of his work, because I could sense that somehow the work he was doing in ballet and also in fashion actually flooded back into the other work. And there's an example here of a fashion image, probably shot for a bazaar, and then the same set used for a different kind of photograph he took of a friend of his who was a ballet dancer. And here an official photograph for ballet theater that is related to this. And there's something about this work that evokes later artists, some names that have come up as I've talked to people walking through the exhibition, or Peter Hujar, of course, but even someone like Simone Forti. And I really wanted to incite diachronic associations such as these, or let the exhibition be open enough for that possibility to emerge. This is a 1945 article in Fortune magazine called "The Boom in Ballet," which states, "The dancers are gifted, the public response is superb, the bookkeeping is provocative." It's illustrated here with costume and set designs by Eugene Berman. I'm just going to read 2 passages, but the language is pretty great. "There can be little doubt that the most striking artistic development of the past American decade has been the new popular success of ballet. The total audience for these troupes may be estimated at over 1.5 million and the gross take at 2 million. Even Hollywood has been infected. Some of the leading ballerinas have been seen along Wilshire Boulevard. Some people feel the magic at once." And the photographs here are also by Walker Evans. "Others require considerable educating as to what they are supposed to see. But learning has been proceeding rapidly in the past decade. A whole new American audience has been discovering the fine art whose diaphanous graces have been rugged enough to withstand every world upheaval since 1700. And this is in the December 1945 issue of Fortune. "Aside from the audiences on the road, it is estimated that at least half the ballet's metropolitan public are people who had never seen a pirouette 10 years ago." And then it goes on. In Virgil Thompson's classic observation, quote, "Dancers are autoerotic and have no conversation," end quote. "They are professionally obliged to have a preoccupation with their own bodies, and there can be little doubt that a narcissistic degree of it has often helped to promote the extraordinary graces the great soloists achieve. But if dancers spend much of their time in that erotic direction that Sigmund Freud declares is natural to all in infancy, it is a truism that many male dancers are also homosexual. This is perhaps very largely due to the middle-class prejudice against dancing as a male profession. Few boys are encouraged in a dancing bent that might lead to a ballet career. In any case, the androgynous effect provided by many male ballet dancers is not admired by ballet specialists any more than it is by steam fitters who have wandered in out of curiosity. The ideal is the pliant, vigorous, masculine air." These slides by the dance critic and literary executor of Gertrude Stein's estate, and fan and supporter of the Harlem Renaissance, Carl Van Vechten, taken between the 1940s and sort of the end of the 1950s, mostly of ballet theater productions, were something I discovered in the dance division of the New York Public Library. They constitute, for me, what the historian Jasmine Ralt would call an archive of feeling. I'd always seen Van Vechten photos in black and white, very milky, and I realized when I came upon these beautiful, well-preserved color slides that it's because he was making prints from color slides. The library was kind enough to allow us to digitize a selection of 820 of these photographs, which feature countless dancers: Alicia Markova, Arthur Mitchell, you see Janet Collins. You'll also note that they're stamped. Van Vechten's handwriting identifies the subjects and dates them. The costume designer Barbara Karinska, the lighting designer Jean Rosenthal, people in formal poses enacting characters and scenes from particular ballets, but then also in these very intimate, informal, and playful poses where you sense the rapport between the subject and the photographer. They're having fun in his apartment. That's Agnes de Mille. And he has these elaborate backdrops. He must have had a huge fabric collection, and fresh flowers come into play. They're really making a story of it. This is Alicia Markova in the Matisse costume for The Red and the Black, and a whole series of just Alicia Markova's famous hands. Arthur Mitchell with Swedish Christmas Angels. Todd Bolender in the original Kurt Seligman costumes for the Four Temperaments as the phlegmatic temperament. And 4 of the dancers from Agnes Mille's first ballet, Black Ritual, also known as Obeah. As I found material such as this, I became more and more caught up in the relationship that these works suggest. The social, professional, sexual, and collaborative relationships among all these people. And it was no longer this question of artists making designs for dance, sort of being hired, but I saw this real synergy and also sometimes tension between these worlds, and arrived at a moment of realizing that art history and dance history of this moment are inseparable. This is an argument that museums are slowly beginning to make as they question how dance and performance is archived and presented, but also how it is that modernisms might be interrogated and reframed. The Whitney exhibition is by no means comprehensive and quite fragmentary, but I think that does speak in some ways also to the way that ballet is carried forward and transmitted. It relies very much on memory and on a personal point of view, and I think that's also something I keep finding when I look at ballet-specific objects in the exhibition that are not really classifiable as works of art, like the Diaghilev calling card, for example. They have a different resonance. People recognize things in them or remember things in them or read into them so differently than they would, say, a painting. And I think that part of it has to do with the fact that dances are multi-authored events in time. It was important to me that this exhibition bring to light a large number of the performing artists who shaped and invented this form and were also in dialogue with other forms. Some views of the empty exhibition. One of the challenges I wanted to put on the museum was to present works from their collection on the same plane as artifacts and documents that would not normally appear within this context, such as Balanchine rehearsal tapes or Anne Barzell's shaky bootleg films of various dance productions, as well as the work of performers living in New York today. And I wanted to put pressure on the fact that, as Claire Bishop has noted, only certain forms of dance are sanctioned in museum settings. I was interested in seeing how the readings of artworks is changed or enlarged by the presence of these other traces and gestures, and what could happen in this very layered sensorial environment, to present both the historical dimension and to pose current questions around art and dance in the museum. I put out an open call describing this project and auditioned dancers in the Center for Ballet and the Arts Rehearsal Studio, dancers who were interested in working with me in a certain way in relation to this material, so that we would follow, in some ways, the process of encountering these images and films for the first time. I was interested in seeing how dancers would respond to some of these images and sculptures and paintings, as well as films. So we went to the library, to the dance division, and looked at a lot of material together. And of course, they saw completely different things than I did. And then we went back into the studio and started working together. I purposely cast dancers from very different backgrounds. Only a few of them are still working in ballet. though all of them have a foundation in ballet that they were keen to revisit or question. Many people want to know exactly what the dancers are performing, but I wanted the relationship between the performance and the historical objects in the exhibition to be less direct than that, so that it would not appear as an illustration or a historical reenactment. What I liked about working with this group of people who had previously not known each other is that you can see subsequent layers of training and styles coming together, and their responses as artists to the things that are in this exhibition. I very much wanted this exhibition to be a new work that is made for and in the museum and takes its shape here for the first time, where the process is very much visible. A lot of issues surfaced in our working together, and I'm not sure we resolved any, but I thought that the best this exhibition could do is to bring problems to light. How possible it is to distribute authorship fairly, how the dancer's labor is valued and acknowledged, how to deal with the fact that museum audiences are frequently infantilized, that the museum is itself becoming an apparatus that produces event images, that audiences' capacities and demands are changing in the face of the interfaces to which they are bonded and which change the way we see, remember, and relate to one another, perhaps best evidenced in the violence of constantly photographing everything and everyone without asking for consent. I don't think there's time to tell you about the appearance of Louise Lawler's image of Degas' little dancer on the costumes. Here's me trying it out. Or the making of the filling station costume, which was made in dialogue with artist Andreas Solstad. But those were also important collaborations that I invited into the framework of this exhibition. To end, I can show you some images of everything coming together. The exhibition, the performers, but of course also the museum audience is very much a part of this work. And I'll recount two significant pieces of feedback I've received so far. One I overheard from two teenage girls coming off the elevator onto the 8th floor and exclaiming, "This is the gayest thing I've ever seen, I love it." And the other came from an artist colleague who approached me in the gallery and said firmly, "The show doesn't answer anything." Thank you.
I guess I'm the hostess. I have to start this off, but I've also had the most access to you, Nick, so I'm going to defer to our guests to ask most of the questions tonight about what you presented to us. But I guess first off, a big thanks for doing tonight what you've done for months, which is to take every step so seriously in this exhibition and in this proposal. This is the kind of project that museums could have worked on for years and years, 20, 30 years, who knows? I mean, this is an immense intellectual challenge that you took on and across several art forms and in periods that you didn't necessarily know you were walking into 6 months before you started this project. So I think I can only speak for myself. Other curators would have probably gone running and screaming and been worried that you weren't going to be able to, in the amount of time you had to do this, to produce this kind of totally finished idea of what the relationship was, even in this very specific period between the art world and the dance world in New York City. That could have gone on for months and years. But the fact that you plunged in and that you decided to take such a specific, individual a climb down into certain things which you've identified tonight, the Kinsey Institute, the Jennifer's Institute. You took each of these selected things so seriously and made the most of it in the short period of time. And the fact that you accepted the fact that this wasn't going to be definitive and you didn't want it to be definitive in a way. You wanted it to be somehow resembling this art form itself, ballet. It was sort of here and not here. It had all this great traditional stuff, but it was like going to go away too, as a combination of things. So those are some of my thoughts about how I saw you approach this, that I had the pleasure of watching as this unfurled. Now I'm going to defer, though, a little bit to people who are really just kind of, Jennifer is in a different situation. Do you want to start off, Jennifer? Because you were there right in the beginning, too.
Sure.
Almost in the beginning.
I'm very happy to be here. I have seen this in bits and pieces as it has come together. And so, I'm just I thought maybe I would just offer a couple of reflections on what I experienced as I saw the exhibition, and some questions I have for you, Nick. I come from the dance background in particular, and as I went through it, I thought, okay, here we've got two things. We've got an argument and a kind of very intense atmosphere. And it seems to me that it speaks to two sides of you that are kind of in conversation, but maybe also a little bit in tension in the exhibition, which is the artist and the historian. Because I know you're an artist, but I also know you as a historian because I've seen you go through these materials and document things and look at the timing and your interest in, as you put it, I think, social forms. And so, the arguments seem to me to be as you pretty much as you laid it out, but maybe I saw it slightly differently, which has to do with the ways in which the history of art and the history of dance come together at this particular moment in very important ways, and especially the history of ballet. And it seems to me you were really insisting on that. And the thing that's interesting to me about that is that you say all that, and then there's these two figures that to me are just so present in this exhibition, which is George Balanchine and Lincoln Kirstein. And the way I am looking at this, I'm wondering, how you're thinking about both of them, because in my mind, the exhibition is in a way Kirstein's view, which I think is very different from the view or the experience that we have of Balanchine, even in this moment, even though they are coming together, they are all working with these people, Arendt, Chelychev. Let's just take Chelychev, as the starting point, because he's everywhere. Yeah. And he's so important to Kirstein, and he's very important to Balanchine too, in the beginning. But I think the Chelychev of Balanchine is a little bit different he's more, this Russian kind of the angels and the ethereal and the otherworldly, whereas Kirstein's interested in what he calls that supercharged reality and more of the kind of images that you presented in the exhibition. So I guess one of the questions I have is kind of how do you see the relationship in the dance sections between the vision of Balanchine and the vision of Kirstein, and where does surrealism sort of come from and go and lead to as you think about that? And then I guess maybe later, because I've talked for a long time, we could talk about eroticism, which I think is very essential to ballet, and you've really hit that, but again, you've hit it from Kirstein's view. It's from a more of a homoerotic point of view, rather than the Balanchine side, which would have been a kind of deep engagement and obsession with femininity, beauty, feminine beauty, and sort of, the eternal feminine.
Well, that's
I don't know
a big question. Thank you.
It's like a little scattered, but there we go. You take it wherever you want.
Well, I think that the first thing, and of course you're right, Kirstein and Balanchine are all over the show in different ways, and the influence on the cultural landscape is enormous. But I also did not want this to turn into a Kirstein and Balanchine show. But it is the more I looked, I realized, well, there are these other companies and people doing all these other things, and then it sort of blurs with with modern dance, and you know, can Martha Graham be included or not? You know, it was very hard to really find the borders of what this was going to be as an exhibition. But you know, certainly I was interested in the aesthetics that Kirstine promoted, which are also very hard to unify. You know, on the one hand, Walker Evans, on the other hand, Ellie Nodelman, or you know, it just seemed to be a very strange person. But you know, most of these works are not often seen, or they're seen as kind of tertiary. So that's something I then kind of immediately want to look to. Why are these works sort of less a part of the conversation? What is gained by preventing access to them? Or
you mean the truncated side that you were talking about?
Mm-hmm.
You know, I think that's the word you used,
Mm-hmm.
right? In your really beautifully written. What do you call those? You know, the things that are in the exhibition. It's just so beautiful.
On the wall.
On the walls, yes, the things on the walls. The wall text, yeah.
And you know as I was looking at the kinds of poses, the way the figure is treated in documentation of these dances, in the fashion photographs, and then thinking about it in relation to the kind of figuration that I guess you would say is sort of the Kirstine version. There's a lot of expression there that seems very, very far away, a kind of sense of drama, and emotion, and something that maybe comes before camp. That was very interesting to me. And then, you know, part of me felt like, well, and then it stops. But then I've also had conversations recently with people who would say, you know, actually, if you look at the first issues of Interview in black and white, you have Carl Van Vechten, all these people making contributions.
Wait, what do you mean it
to
stops?
Interview magazine. You know, that
At a certain point, this vision dies out.
Yeah. And I think sort of, I thought that looking at both sort of the artworks and then also ways of dancing that were practiced at the same time, sort of, you know, what the trajectories were and how they were rerouted and what was kind of edited out. And that it would be interesting to bring a lot of this to the surface again. The kind of, you know, I look very seriously at decorative art. There's a lot of, you know, very kind of decorative trompe-l'oeil elements, sort of citation of all kinds of different styles in a lot of the artworks in the exhibition that, you know, don't mesh well with the version of all this that won out in the end, which is clean, you know, classical, refined. So I kind of wanted to, you know, turn it over and see, well, what is there for us to look at or talk about in this other set of aesthetics? And in terms of surrealism, you know, and eroticism as kind of connecting webs here, that was surprising to me. You know, I don't know enough about the kind of transference of surrealism from Europe to America, but it's a big part of the story. And that was also a question that interested me in terms of making an exhibition at this museum. Is what is the story of modern American art made by artists who are, in many cases, not American, you know, including Balanchine, but you know, so visual artists, performing artists. I think that the kind of surrealism that came to America is really filters in heavily through these commercial platforms. I mean, through magazines, but then there's also these kind of little magazines, and you know, View, Dance Index, you know, with covers by Joseph Cornell, right? And major exhibitions. So, yeah, I mean,
do you think it would be fair to say, because it seemed to me in a way that you were establishing that there's really a kind of radical beginning to ballet in America, that, you know, people often see it as being a classical form transported onto from Europe, from European, and mainly from, you know, large state institutions, and very much on the right, not on the left. You know, that there's really actually a kind of radical grounding of the classical tradition, what we think of as the classical tradition. And
Regrounding.
Yeah, regrounding.
I mean, that's something I would love to
be able
hear
to claim.
you talk about. Not to be able to claim, but it did seem to me that the context for this form had to be made, and of course Kirstine tried to make it. Other people tried to make it in using various methods. But one thing that I came across that I found really interesting is that the way ballet was taught at this time, and correct me if I'm wrong, was very piecemeal and combined with many other styles of dance. So that's another thing that did not correspond to my my understanding of this art form, is that in fact it's not pure at all. There are no direct lines, and of course you would have teachers who had trained with the Imperial Russian Ballet, who were kind of dropped here and there on these various tours, but then you'd also have people who would just pick things up, and whatever was most balletic would suffice, and you could put it in the mix with so many other things. And the fact that ballet at this time, and also earlier in Europe, was starting to be treated as this very elastic concept that could be treated very subversively, is really interesting to me. And certainly in this period in New York,
I think you're
took
absolutely
on
right.
many
I don't
different
have
forms.
any. I mean, that seems to me. I don't want you.
Elena, jump in.
Well,
Yeah.
what I find completely fascinating is that you managed to make an exhibition that would allow scholars like yourself to find sort of yourself, to find the things you know, the things you don't yet know, or the arguments that you haven't yet seen somewhere else made in the exhibition. And someone like myself, who I can't proclaim at all to be able to nerd out on dance methods, and I'm by no means a dance specialist, but we did meet actually in a dance piece, as it happens. And I come at it from a completely different perspective, but what I have found so fascinating, being here this week in New York, talking to people about the show, or hearing people talk to me about the show, and they've referred to it in a very particular way, because on the one hand, they've noted that it is touted as a solo show by Nick Mauss at the Whitney. And then a colleague said, yes, but it's a curated show. It's not a work of Nick Mauss. And a kind of discussion erupts about, is this a work by Nick Mauss? Is he the historian curator of the exhibition? And it happens that this show is on at the same time, it's fortuitous, that there is Jan Vo's show, for instance, at the Guggenheim. And I was struck by how none of those same colleagues would say, well, the Guggenheim show is curated by Jan Vo, but not actually of Jan Vo works. Although what he has done is effectively sort of researched, found, taken from their context a number of objects where the history of the objects themselves is extremely important. In many ways, like what you're doing, with a different claim, of course, because at the end of the day, those remain objects by the artist Jan Vo. And in your case, you've chosen this position of being someone who, for a time, they are in your orbit, and then they go back to the respective archives, museums, collections. But for this moment in time, and you had this gorgeous description of dance where you called it a multi-authored event in time. And I thought that's how you could describe this thing that you've made, a multi-authored event in time, and maybe every exhibition is a multi-authored event in time. So more, I guess my question would be, as someone who's fascinated by the history of artist-curated exhibitions, to just ask you about where you see yourself, or do you see yourself in this lineage? And how does it feel, on the one hand, to have made a show, your first solo in New York, in an institution, that is also somehow, for some people at least, not quite your show, and what you would answer to that?
Yeah. Thank you for that. it's a conundrum I found myself in before with the work I presented in the 2012 biennial that I worked on with Elisabeth and Jay. The work that I presented also had this effect of kind of disappearing me, which I was fine with. And I think especially within the context of an exhibition like a biennial, I felt like there were expectations on the exhibition that I wanted to sidestep. In terms of seeing myself in a lineage of artists as curators, I would say that I'm indebted to people I studied with, you know, the practitioners of institutional critique. I think there's a lot in those modes of working that sort of comes back to me. I also studied with some wonderful historians, and there was a moment in working where I felt as though I was always leaving something out of my exhibitions. That you know, these images I collect, or these things that I have around that I'm staring at forever, and some of which I shared with you, that there's something to be said there as well about what my work is. And in the last few years, I've had the opportunity to be in these situations of just working on wonderful exhibitions and projects where my authorship is challenged. So, you know, for example, I was invited by the Nouveau Musée National de Monaco to make an exhibition design for a show about Leon Bakst. And the curator of that exhibition, Celia Bernasconi, really understood that it would be my work, but it would also have to do double duty as something else. At the time, at first I thought, oh, Leon Bakst, I'm not sure, it's not avant-garde enough, and you know, it's Orientalist and dusty and weird. But I got really involved in that work and sort of understanding, you know, how many very important productions he worked on that really had a huge effect on culture, and then also, not to mention textile designs. There was a lot of material to kind of recombine and not just to make cohesive, but to really think about how to treat the exhibition as an experimental form, even the didactic exhibition, which that was intended to be. It was really meant to narrate, you know, these are the major productions that Bakst worked on, and you know, I started noticing that the way I was working and relating to the material of the objects that were being exhibited really felt like any other work that I would do, and needed no justification, really. But in terms of, you know, what is my job? You know, I would also have to say that there was a reason not to call this an artist-curated project, because I think that is another category that often feels like, you know, this person selects, you know, an eclectic array of things, which I'm not interested in. So to make the claim that it is my exhibition, even though it also accommodates various collaborations and certainly is mostly constituted by artworks that I have not made. I think it also asks the question about them, you know, well, what is it, and what has been made, and what are the decisions and thoughts behind all of this? And you know, I think it just sort of displaces expectations in a way that can be productive, and you know, it is also a thinking through appropriation in some way also, though that would not be the word that I would use to describe how I think about, work with, and convey artworks by other people. You know, I really think of this work as the making of new relationships, the tracing of some existing relationships, and then also trying to open up and sort of make accessible in a new way these things. I don't know if that's fully...
It is. In fact, I mean, you did it already in the show brilliantly, and in a way that's what I wanted to get you to say, because it is the answer that I gave in a much less articulate way to colleagues who asked the question, what is this? But I think that the exhibition is so many things. It's a dance history, it's a social history, it's a queer history, it's an avant-garde art history, it's the history of the transmission, as the title implies, between Europe and America. But it is also a problem that you have left a problem for people to grapple with about where you draw the lines of the authorship, of the lines of where an artwork begins and ends, and what you call the person who does what you do. And you did that fantastically, and your work does it again and again and again. And I was privileged to see the 212 Biennial, to see the Frieze project, to see a number of projects, to know about these other exhibitions where you've played a role and had different titles, whether it's scenographer or artist more clearly. But in each case, you seem to be grappling with the problem.
Nick, I'd like you to talk, if you could, about two outstanding parts of this exhibition. One of them are how you came to use live dancers, because I don't think in the very beginning that was absolutely a certain thing that you were going to do. So can you talk a little bit about that? And also get around a little bit to talking about the Van Vechten slideshow, because it is one of the amazing discoveries of this exhibition, so I'd love to hear you just say what you think about that. But start with the live dancers.
Okay, so I was invited by the curator Nicola Lees in 2014 to realize a new work to be presented at the Frieze Art Fair, and it was Nicola, in fact, who had seen the work in the 2012 Biennial and challenged me to consider working with dancers. At that point, I had always thought that the sort of performative dimension of my work was really all on spectators, sort of being in those spaces and trying to make sense of them. And she made it possible for me to work with a ballet company in Leeds and to consult with dancer and dance archivist Kate Coyne, and to also have as a sort of interlocutor and a collaborator the choreographer Lorena Randi. And we made a kind of dance, I think at that point heavily inspired by my love of Nijinsky, and also given the difficulty of the setting of the art fair, I think that work played very much with harsh contrasts. So there were these dancers on the one hand, and then I'd also invited the artists Kim Gordon and Juliana Huxtable to perform new texts that they had written specifically for this. And this was going on all day long for 5 days with a art fair audience wandering in and out, and often frustrated or impatient. And there was something going on there in all those dynamics that was really interesting to me. And I didn't know when I would make another project working with dancers, but there was so much that I didn't know, I realized, in this process of working with the dance company, that I in fact had required these sort of translators who could help to transfer what I recognized in the Nijinsky ballets that I think are interesting to a company that works in a totally different way and doesn't have that in their frame of reference at all. Shortly thereafter, actually, I think is when I went to Brussels to see the exhibition you had made, where you had the brilliant idea to invite Anna Teresa de Keersmaeker to make a performance as an exhibition for, 3 months. And the minute I heard of it, I just thought, I have to see this. This is so interesting. This is really unlike any kind of format that I know of. And I had also grown increasingly frustrated with the way dance performances are just sort of, clicked and dragged into museums. So I was there for a day, and it was incredible. Her dancers are remarkable, and the kind of push and pull through these museum spaces, because in Brussels it was in two adjoining galleries, visitors following dancers or musicians in and out of these spaces, just, and the whole proposition, what would it mean to make a danced exhibition? I think you had used the word, to take the protocols of the museum and put them on a performance, was so exciting. And as time went on, I saw other performances that were really eye-opening. A few by Tragil Harrell, made for very intimate spaces at MoMA at weird hours, like at midnight or 10 o'clock. And also had some conversations with him. And it just seemed to me that I wanted to have another opportunity to work with performers, but also, as I had mentioned, I kept seeing certain kinds of dance in the museum, but ballet and other forms are really not seen, and so I started to wonder why that was. Was it so difficult to integrate them? Were people just not interested? Was there a kind of stigma? I had certainly, had prejudices against ballet, and that sort of drove me to look further and realize, well, everything that I am interested in at this moment keeps to have this other facet that reflects ballet. So, what happens when you put all those things together? And as to the Carl van Vechten slideshow, I mean, that was just, a moment in the library where I, nearly started to cry because, as I tried to explain, you really have such a sense of intimacy looking at those images, and you get a whole kind of duration with some of them as well. He clearly loved photographing Alicia Markova and Hugh Lang, and photographs of specific productions turn into these kind of strip teases or fantasy costume making sessions. And on the one hand, I found them interesting as documents that tried to fix specific poses and sort of as though lifted from an actual dance. Of course, they never really capture the dance. And then on the other hand, I just thought they were such amazing documents of a kind of wish to present a self or invent a self, and to also play with and completely discard given roles. I've spoken to a number of people who said they remind them of Jack Smith, or things again that come later. And I don't know how many people would have been able to see these images. Some of them circulated, but they were really made for private use. Out of a love for photography and dance, and forcing people into your apartment, locking the door, and just taking a lot of pictures. And I. The amateurishness in the sense of, loving is so apparent in those works. And so as soon as I saw them, and it seemed that the library was going to be, forthcoming in letting us borrow them and show them, and didn't blink an eye at the fact that I wanted to show them as a slideshow, I also felt that brought a totally other dimension of life into the exhibition. Because I was wary of an exhibition with live dancers. It just sort of always clicks into place in a certain way for people. The exhibition design, the kind of layering of different media, attempts to really bring in kind of other forms of like liveliness and other ways of thinking about making images. I mean, that's really the thing that surprised me so much about the Van Vechtens, is that I'd never seen images that were made like that. I wanted to ask, I mean, one thing that interested me, Jennifer, was kind of how if you could talk a bit about sort of the popularization of ballet, or even give a sense
that
of...
article that you read from, that was amazing.
You know, how did it go from this kind of elite form to something... you know, that was another thing that struck me, finding, you know, the Chelychev design for a ballet called St. Francis, and then finding the photograph of the ballet set turned into a display for shoes in a department store. That there was this popular dimension.
Right. I mean, look, that happened very much as you, I mean, the piece that you pulled up, was it 45? Mm-hmm. The ballet boom piece. Mm-hmm. I mean, that's kind of said it right there. Mm-hmm. I mean, I think what really happened was that what happened was the Russian Revolution is really what happened. And then there was this massive immigration of people from Russia and Europe to the States, of which some of the people, including Balanchine, are in your exhibition, are part of. Mm-hmm. And you know, including also lots of dancers who are not so well known and that nobody had heard of. And they sort of went on tours all over the US, and they fanned out, and some of them stayed and set up little schools in small towns in Ohio, and they really sort of populated the land, seeded the landscape. And so it became a kind of education. And I think then there was also, you know, there was a certain glamour to it. Mm-hmm. And you know, you can see pictures of these people on these Amtrak trains, and they're going across the country for these one-night stands in these theaters, and they eat at Woolworths in the morning, and they, you know, but they're wearing fur coats. Mm-hmm. Because they're Russian dancers, and they're, you know, so there's a certain, they played it, and that was part of it. So I think then, you know, Anna Pavlova mm-hmm. was such a phenomenon that there were moments when, you know, young girls would actually have fits of hysteria if they saw her. I mean, they could become physically ill. Mm-hmm. You know, this was a kind of phenomenon, mm-hmm. right? So then it does, as you say, go deep into the popular culture, into commercial culture and advertising. So that's all there. But what's interesting to me too is that what's coming is not actually a very elite, old-fashioned 19th century classical form that would have been performed in, you know, the imperial theaters. Mm. Because the art that was coming either through Diaghilev and the Ballet Russe, which is a little bit before the revolution, or just after the revolution, in which case it's all been thrown up into the air, and it's very radical and very much, I think, you know, this would be a question, is sort of part of the whole aura of your exhibition has a sort of almost forward-looking feel to me, just because, I don't know, maybe I'm wrong about that, but I wondered, you know, just to turn the question back to you, whether you thought about it as also something that looks backwards, or whether any of you do, because I look at that and I think, oh, that's, you know, some of the Russian constructivist. That's coming from a different moment that's passing through Europe, but it's not only that. And so it's interesting that it's popular, but it's also not necessarily elite or class. It's not a coming down of, right?
I think in terms of looking back or looking forward, and you know, that's something that especially comes to the surface in ballet, that it's sort of always doing both of those things, or actually going in multiple directions. This sense of histories that are contained in the literatures of ballet, you know, go in so many directions. And I've always been interested in influence, and how influence travels, and, you know, is how it moves through different people and is distorted over time. And that's just something I've always found myself doing, and sort of making connections in that way. You know, because I'm interested in the resonance of works of art, and, you know, I experience them myself, and, you know, that's, so to me, it's not, you know, I wanted to show work from this particular period because I do think it speaks to this period. You know, not because it's historical.
Because you said
or,
it.
You know, And I often have that. I mean, there's this great quote by Carl van Vechten who says, there are a great many people who are dead who are more alive than most people who are alive, which, you know, I felt very much in you know, looking at a lot of the works in this show. So.
I do think that Jennifer was right in that you've probably emphasized the Lincoln Kirstein side of this story. And I think I've heard you say that you didn't set out to do that, but you also didn't want to promote Balanchine as being the sort of center of this. But it's curious about Lincoln Kirstein that he seems suddenly to be of interest. It's not just you, but I remember 10 years ago when I first came to the Whitney, and it was the centennial of Lincoln Kirstein's birth or something. And the people who wanted to celebrate this, the people who were left at New York City Ballet who knew him, went shopping all around to all the New York museums to try to get a museum that would do something to show Kirstein's effect on the arts in New York. Everybody said no.
That's interesting.
Everybody said no, except two of us at the Whitney said, great, we're going to do that. We think that's great. We have things in our collection that he gave us, that our collection kind of reflects his interest, and that we would take a stab at it. So I don't think anybody came to see the show or cared who Lincoln Kirstein was or anything like that. But suddenly, here we are 10 years later, and Lincoln Kirstein has had a major biography. I don't know whether anybody has read that book. He's going to be the subject, I guess I can say it, of a major show at the Museum of Modern Art, which is an institution that he had contributed to the founding of, which he walked out of, or they threw him out. I'm not sure what's the right story there. But he certainly contributed to their collections and their collecting history in the area of performance and theater and certainly photography. And yet nobody wanted to claim him, I don't think, at all. And he had very odd and eccentric views and very conflicting views that didn't fit in at all with anybody's idea of the progression of great American art. So here he is, and you've given him sort of a position, but not necessarily a leadership position, but a position in this exhibition, and certainly in a way brought his tastes a little bit to the fore. So I think that's interesting.
Sorry. I have a question, because I wondered, going through it, if a dance historian would, like knowing this material, if they could ever imagine curating the same kind of show, or the same show, let's say. Because I agree with you completely, you don't feel going through the exhibition that this is about Nick Mauss's taste. It's not an exercise in connoisseurship at all. There's deep historical research, and you feel it reverberating. But there's also an idiosyncrasy, what you called at what point in your lecture a kind of tertiary material that you looked at that perhaps a historian or a curator would find sort of not relevant to an argument. But I'm just curious, not only would a historian or a curator of dance curate a show like this, but also will this change the way exhibitions of dance are curated in the future? Because I'm convinced the history of avant-garde artist-curated exhibitions has changed the history of how exhibitions have been made by non-artists. So that's sort of a question for both of you.
That's a very interesting question. Do you want me to go? Do you want to go? You go. Why don't you go?
When I was working on the Leon Bakst exhibition in Monaco, that was a very pressing question because there were gouaches and costumes, and that was basically it. And how do you make an exhibition about dance or spaces of like the visual field that dance produced at that time, and then how do you give a sense of the outrage that these exhibitions produced, or why people were fainting when they saw these things. So what the leftovers of these productions, how can they be made to not even tell a story, but just sort of make people curious? That was something I really thought about a lot, and I think in this case also I was wondering, well, what would be an interesting way to show dance, and as I tried to explain, one idea that I thought was important was to actually show sort of, to contextualize a performance with sort of historical works without putting them sort of, making them too dependent on one another, and then also actually letting each individual work in the show sort of be its own world that opens up. I don't know. I mean, how you?
One thing that comes to my mind when you were talking and just listening to you is that, it should be said that there are no dances. There are dancers doing dances that are made today, but there are no historical. There are no dances of Balanchine in this show. There are costume designs. And one of the reasons for that is that those dances are mostly lost, and we don't know what they look like, and we don't have them except for these, as you say, there is something very interesting about making a show around, I think the word you use in your wall, what is it, wall words? Wall text is absence. And there is an absence. It's in a way impossible to make, it would seem to me, just as a historian, and I don't know how you would feel about that, Elizabeth.
I think that one of the true things that makes this exhibition come to life is the eroticism of it, and the desire that you allow to be shown in it on all sorts of levels. From the minute you get off the elevators, you're in this world, and the world is introduced to you there, if that's the introduction, as being a world of bodies, yes, but of erotic charge and desire, and a lot of it male desire, which is a reflection of what was actually going on. And it's kind of that level which I think is missing from dance history exhibitions, because I wouldn't in no way reduce the experience of going to the ballet as being an experience of just plain, erotic charge, but none, because there's all sorts of levels of appreciation and connoisseurship. But I think this is the level that you came to bring into this exhibition that gives it a certain character and feeling. Yeah, that's the main thing.
But also there's this incredible object in the exhibition which has a wholly ambiguous status. This piece of architecture that with stairs that is, references in my view when I saw it, a kind of opera balcony almost, but also is only accessible to the dancers themselves, who then can look at other dancers, but also look at the spectators. It seems with the exhibition, you've also turned it into an apparatus for seeing, for us seeing from the moment we get out of the elevator through the scrims and just spying voyeuristically the bodies moving back and forth as we look at the photographs of just that. So there's, I could imagine that no dance historian would have constructed such an object.
Because it is, as you say, a kind of work of art, right? Your exhibition is its own world that's created.
What you say about how it sort of turns into an apparatus for seeing. I think that scrim that sort of introduces you into the show, one of the things I wanted it to do was to actually sort of signal to you immediately what you were going to see, that there are sort of many aspects confronting one another, and sort of different kinds of vision that also relate to memory. It also was to actually sort of think about the different spaces of the museum and how they're connected. The restaurant needed a corridor, and I didn't just want people to spill into a show that they could take in one go, but to make something actually quite circuitous that you might get lost in, and then that would have its own pace. And suddenly you might realize that perhaps you're not supposed to be here because it's actually not your space. And but in terms of types of seeing, that really had a lot to do with how I installed the exhibition. You know, the kind of the feeling of being in an archive or in the museum storage and looking at this thing for the first time. I wanted that somehow to become apparent. And there's also this kind of, you know, a little bit clunky kind of model-like play with different scales. So you have this little corps de ballet of Nadelman sculptures on the one hand, then you have this kind of larger tableau of that's almost like a cityscape in which the Lincoln Kirstein striding sculpture and the Nadelmans seem to relate to each other all of a sudden. And there's that crazy kind of corner with the large Nadelmans and the tiny sort of offering dish with the Diaghilev note card. So these kind of, you know, almost like perspectival effects of memory and sort of engagement with something seemed really important. You know, even though they serve no purpose, just as that stairway really, you know, I mean, I remember, Elisabeth, you were sort of asking me about it, as I'd shown you this kind of sketch, and you said, well...
I was thinking, though, that stairway has a source in that you had seen it sort of in you had a sense of it from some of the Platt lines photographs and also from the Jared French kind of
there's
painting.
There's great architecture in the Platt lines photographs. You know, I don't... The staircase that Paul Cadmus and Jared French are sort of lying on, being one, and that kind of notion of a set for obviously performance, but also for a photograph, seemed to me to be an important aspect of the exhibition.
We should make time for questions, I think, right, Megan? Yeah. So, okay, is that okay? I think there's a microphone. Or...
Does it work? Yeah. Okay. I'm a former ballet dancer. Is it on? Sorry. Yeah, it's just on. Okay. And I never thought I would see ballet represented in a museum setting, or I'd always wondered about it. I never thought I would put my hand on a bar in a museum, or see all these people like experiencing dance in this way. It was really wonderful. And so my question is that in an art form such as dance, which somewhat lives and dies in the very same moment, and you know, in this world right now that is like made for pictures, right, and grasping for relevancy, like where do you think ballet is going, or where would you like to see it go?
I was saying to somebody that I feel like I'm really, you know, sort of scratching the surface of a prism. You know, this is a really vast territory, and you know, there are dancers working today that I think are really interesting. I think there is a problem in the way that sort of set repertoires are performed, and I don't know what can be done about that. You know, there's something sort of that's like ossified or weirdly overinterpreted, but you know, I would just like to see more. I don't feel like I'm the person who can answer that question. You know.
I was curious for outsiders' insight a little bit.
Hi, I'm Stephen Frankel. Nice to see you again, Nick.
Hi.
This is connected to that question. You spoke about your prejudices against ballet when you were talking, and does that have to do with this ossification? And what's the relationship to the repertoire of Balanchine and the Diaghilev ballets, which you clearly seem to love?
You know, the prejudices had no good justification. I just had a sense that it was inaccessible, very far away. I didn't know anything about it. It was intimidating. I think that would be a prejudice. You know, and then sort of my this historical angle of incidence helped me see actually, that, oh, this is something I want to look at. These are texts that I want to engage with. What do I love about the Diaghilev productions? You can, in a way, invent them for yourself, since you can only reconstruct them based on the few images and sort of narratives we have about them. I have to say that some of the Balanchine dances, when I see them now, and often for the first time, strike me as being performed in this kind of sort of sexy, friendly way that I don't think they were ever intended to have. I mean, I've only had that sort of here and there where I thought, I think there's something has been added on, or or something evolved over time, and perhaps there was also a demand for it.
Transmission.
Yeah.
Oh.
I'm just so thrilled that someone pointed out and that people are agreeing that the eroticism is so important. And I'm a ballet teacher and also a burlesque teacher. And I'm a specialist in Delsarte, which Elena Rondi is Italy's top Delsartian. I used the same technique to teach both. And when people ask me, were there ever boylesque, was there ever men performing burlesque in the days? And I say, look at the pictures of the ballet dancers then. And to go out there and see your show, it's like those are all burlesque costumes for men. And I found myself thinking, and I wonder how you would think about this upon reflection, that statement about the, real quickly, I also say that Pas de Quatre was just a burlesque show. There was a hand girl and a face girl and a boob girl and a leg girl. And it's just my drunken history of ballet. But the statement about the gay men in the performance strikes me as, within that popularity zone, almost an advertisement. If you might like to see some sexually ambiguous men dancing around in scantily clad costumes, you might want to buy a ticket to the show in your town and be called a fan of the arts. What do you think?
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, I was surprised that it went on at such length.
I mean, look, one of the whole premises of eroticism is concealment. And it's not something that is always necessarily out there on the stage in a sort of revealed way. Because if it was, it wouldn't be eroticism. And I think that's one of the very deep plays that goes on in especially Balanchine's work, but earlier works too. It's just that he's much more sophisticated about it.
I'm interested in whether you plan to do any more performance works, whether you have anything planned, but also how has doing this performance piece exhibition affected your other visual arts work, if at all?
I'm curious to see what that effect will be, and I think it will be a major effect. I feel so lucky that I got to meet these 16 dancers, and also, the work with the entire Whitney performance team and with Morgan, with Greta, has been very intense and intimate, and that's a kind of collaboration on a scale that I didn't know. But I think more than that, it was just that sort of watching the different dancers work and be so patient with me in terms of a very loose framework that I had kind of set up that was very much about searching and me having to kind of catch up with them. I just, I was amazed at how fast all these dancers are. It's just it's a very different way of seeing, and I think having to do with sort of working in such an embodied way, and it's I feel like I got to work with 16 of the most intelligent people I've ever met, and I'm sure it will have an effect on what I continue to do. But I think it's mostly about having this opportunity to speak directly to somebody who's really working in this other form that I hardly know how to even speak about or to. I don't know that I will go on to work in performance again. I'm really interested in dance notation. I think I'm going to look at that. But, yeah.
Hi, my name is Lita Albuquerque, and what I found really fascinating about your work is how you kept the historical in terms of the ballet, but the performance is contemporary. And I wanted you to talk a little bit about that, and the relationship between what I think someone called the architecture and the contemporary and the historical. I think if you just had one or the other, it wouldn't have had as much resonance. Mm-hmm. So I was just curious if you could talk to that.
The decision to think of the exhibition as a kind of place in which something is made came out of this feeling that I'm not the person to tell these stories in an exhaustive way. I can do something else, and I'm interested in doing something else. And the work of sort of interpretation and internalization and sort of selective reading that happened with the dancers who collaborated in the making of the sequence that is performed, that seemed to me like something that could be sort of more interesting or create more resonances, as I said before, than if there had just been a performance of, let's say, set material that was being performed. I've gone into the space almost every day, and I still can't quite figure out what's going on between, how people see the performers and how they take in the information, there's so many moving parts there. I'm not, and I think maybe that. So many other parts are kind of closely fitted together, but to have these two major elements of the exhibition be a bit more difficult in their relationship seemed important to me.
Hi.
Hi.
I just wanted to ask, I feel like everybody spoke about your work as a researcher and artist, and how that manifested in this exhibition. But I also found like this definitely wasn't, I didn't feel like it was a result of your taste, but I still found it highly personal. Mm-hmm. And I felt like, to the extent that I know you, I feel like I really felt you in the exhibition. And so I kind of wanted, and even maybe to a certain extent, the eroticism of it, I felt like I felt your desire, maybe not just desire sexually, but also desire in terms of like your intellectual desire. And I just kind of wanted to, understand, and I think that is what makes it an exhibition, your exhibition, as opposed to maybe a dance historian's exhibition or a curator's exhibition, or basically, or any other artist's exhibition. So I just wanted to ask about that.
Yeah, I mean,
True.
I thank you for that response. I can never sort of outrun my own predilections, probably, and maybe that's just sort of like written all over this show. But I have to be very firm in saying that it's, and it was spoken about here, that it's not a collection of things that I love. That's not, not like. There's a lot there that's very hard for me to, that actually took a long time for me to even want to look at or take seriously. And, I do often find that with this work, and especially, with work that celebrates the decorative, let's say, that, can quickly sort of be seen as a sort of light form. And part of what I'm insisting on is that it's not, that it's actually saturated with a lot of sort of important facts and effects.
But I think as well, if I can jump in, one thing that your exhibition reminds us is that every exhibition is, by whomever makes it, is not a neutral thing, that it is infused with a certain amount of curatorial desire, whether it's to decide what's important or not, but maybe like an art historian or a curator or a dance historian or sort of tries to keep that in check somehow, or to make it invisible however much it seeps through the surface of things. And I always find it so liberating walking through your space. Now I've been a few times, because it reminds me that curators can allow themselves to show a little bit more of it, because they are never neutral things.
Well, I guess that's one more. Okay.
You mentioned Nijinsky. Can you speak to what it is about Nijinsky's choreography that interested you?
Yeah, I like how graphic it is. Again, this relationship between sort of dance and visual art seems to me very apparent in that work, in the kinds of sort of, let's say, folk motifs that get brought into the work.
You're talking about Les Noces?
Les Noces, yeah. And, they're really just monuments in such an interesting way, but also there's a great variety in the kinds of dances that she made. Distance from Les Noces to Les Biches is actually quite huge, and then the work that she made in Hollywood. There's a kind of clarity and like a verve to it. I've never seen contemporary stagings, but I would love to see a number of those dances performed.
Well, thanks, Nick, for being so generous with your thoughts.